Welcome back to AM Agenda. Joining me this morning on our panel of politicians, the Parliamentary Secretary for Employment, Jason Clare. Good morning.
Good morning.
And the Shadow Housing Minister, Scott Morrison. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Scott, yesterday Malcolm Turnbull said that he believes Australia's relationship with China has reached its lowest ebb in years. That was just hours before this gas deal was passed. Should you feel a bit silly about those comments now?
No, I think the relationship always goes down two tracks. I mean, Australia will always need to sell resources to China, and China will always need to buy them. And ExxonMobil and the deal that they've struck here is a massive deal for Australia, and we welcome it. And I think it is in stark contrast to the rhetoric from the Prime Minister, who said that, you know, the private sector's in retreat and we're all, you know, the public sector needs to come and take over the Australian economy. What we're seeing here is a great deal, which ExxonMobil have put together. They're going to sell resources into China. And we have to remember that it was resources and our terms of trade that actually ensured that we avoided a technical recession in March. And that's something that the Prime Minister just doesn't seem to want to talk about. He wants to rewrite history about what's been happening over the last 18 months, which gives him an excuse to keep spending money.
So you think Australia's relationship with China is actually going along okay?
Well, I think Australia's economic relationship with China will always be strong because it's in both countries' interests. But clearly there are some issues in our broader relationship.
I think what it shows is you can stand up for human rights and you can stand up for freedom of speech, but that won't stand in the way of big economic deals. Malcolm Turnbull made another mistake yesterday. He jumped out and said something without checking the facts first. He came out and... Well, no, you've had your say.
Diplomatic relations, though, Jason, because the media, for example, weren't allowed into the signing ceremony of this deal. Usually these things are accompanied by masses of cameras and big, you know, shaking hands and big smiles.
I've been in them in China.
The media
That's true.
weren't allowed anywhere near it yesterday. There's no doubt that diplomatic relations are still pretty...
But this is the important point. You can stand up for human rights. You can stand up for freedom of speech. This is not a business-only approach that the Howard government adopted. We can stand up for the things we believe in, but it won't stand in the way of big economic deals. And the point I'm making is Malcolm Turnbull... No, hang on, you had a go. Let me have a go. So he said... He said that the relations are at a low time ebb, at the same time that you've got the minister turning up to the signing of a $50 billion deal that's going to create 6,000 jobs in construction, thousands of jobs in economic development in Australia. It's another example of bad judgment. I hate to do it, but I'm going to do it 2 weeks in a row and stand up for Wilson Tuckey, because he said it's inexperience and arrogance which is leading to these sorts of mistakes by Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, Scott, of course, we heard Lindsay Tanner there really spruiking the government stimulus packages, saying there's no need to pull back just yet. We saw Treasury say that these stimulus packages have kept Australia out of recession. Malcolm Turnbull voted against those stimulus packages. Is there any regrets there?
No, none at all. I mean, what we're seeing is a consensus that now has emerged which says that the Australian economy is emerging better because it went into this recession better globally. And I think that's the key point that the Prime Minister refuses to acknowledge. He refuses to acknowledge the role of our exports industries in March. Apparently, all of what has happened has happened because of his own personal interventions. Now, there's one reason he wants to do this, and the one reason he won't want to roll back his stimulus or accept any argument that his stimulus should be reconsidered, as our economists are increasingly making, and the Reserve Bank Governor alluded to last week, is he wants to keep spending money. He wants to keep spending money because he has an election next year and he wants to roll out the biggest pork barrelling program in our national history.
It's all about buying votes, Jason.
This mistake goes back to the 18th of February when Malcolm Turnbull decided to vote against the stimulus package. It was the first evidence of bad judgment. When the national accounts came in on the 3rd of June, they showed that Malcolm Turnbull had made a mistake. If we had not stimulated the economy, if we hadn't put that legislation through, we would be in recession right now. The Treasury modelling shows that without the stimulus, the quarterly accounts in March would have been 2% negative. And with that goes a lot of business, goes a lot of job, goes confidence going down rather than going up. He made a mistake on the 18th of February. That led him to flick from fear to smear and the Godwin-Gretsch affair. He's in the problem he's in now because
of the debate as we go up to the next election. The government's saying its stimulus packages deserve credit for keeping Australia out of recession. The opposition saying it was poorly targeted spending.
That's what business says everywhere. Whether I'm talking to big business or small business, they all say the stimulus package is working.
I'm saying more than that. What the Prime Minister did early this year and late last year, his cyclonic predictions about what was going to happen with the Australian economy were clearly overstated. And I think that's an emerging consensus now.
Aren't we all glad?
Well, aren't we glad? Aren't we glad? And he overstated it and didn't acknowledge the inheritance that he had in terms of Australia's regulatory system, our financial strength, our terms of trade, the performance of the export sector, all things that are not part of Labor's story. Apparently, November 23, 2007 was economic ground zero. Nothing happened before Kevin. And as a result, he's over-egged his statements, he's over-egged his stimulus, and they're not prepared to even consider pulling it back which means higher tax, higher debt and higher interest rates.
I'm sure that's the theme we'll see played out again in question time today. I do want to move onto the Senate's vote on the renewable energy targets this week. Scott, do you share some of your Nationals colleagues' concerns that Mr Turnbull and Greg Hunt may have got their tactics wrong in pursuing this, that they may not be insistent enough over demands for extra support for industries like the aluminium sector?
No, I don't agree, and I don't think it's what's been happening on the coalition side. Particularly, I think Greg Hunt's done. I think that Greg Hunt's doing an outstanding job on this, together with Ian Macfarlane. And I think what we'll see is that if the government continues to negotiate in good faith, and that's the question mark, if they continue to negotiate in good faith, I think we'll be able to support this bill this week, as we've always wanted to. We wanted to support it last week, and we'll get a good deal for the environment, which is what we've been working for all week, and a good deal for industry and agriculture. I think these negotiations have been tough, but I think they've shown that when the government will come and negotiate with us, then we can get a good outcome. But they're not always willing to do that.
Well, Jason, as Scott alluded to, one of the big concerns here is that food producers in particular are going to suffer. Are you worried about that?
Oh, I think this is a good example of where Scott and I can agree on something, that both sides of politics want to see this renewable energy legislation go through, and we want to see it go through this week. There continue to through the course of the day. We want it to go through this week. Those negotiations, as you rightly put, are occurring in good faith. I don't want to prejudice what those negotiations look like or what they will finalise, but one thing's for certain, and that is that I think good people on both sides of the House want to see this legislation go forward. It's a good example of what can happen when you negotiate in good faith, but when both sides of politics have a view and there is legislation and there are amendments. The problem we had last week is that the Liberal Party didn't have a view and they didn't have amendments. If they adopted the same approach last week, we would have got the ETS through.
Okay, unfortunately we have run out of time for this morning's program. Scott Morrison, Jason Clare, thanks for joining us as always.
Thanks, Ashley.
And that's all we have time for this edition of AM Agenda. Do join David Spears this afternoon at 4:15 Eastern for PM Agenda. I'll be back with you tomorrow morning. Until then, I'm Ashley Gillen. Thanks for your company.